I died on a Tuesday. The concrete was cold beneath my back. Rain fell in thin needles on my face. Blood pooled around my head, warm, then cooling fast. I remember the taste. Copper. Sharp. Metallic on my tongue. I could hear her laughing somewhere above me. That sound followed me into the dark. There was one thing Camille never knew about that night. I heard everything before I died. Every word. Every laugh. I just never got the chance to use it. Not in that life. I woke up gasping, 16 years old again, in a bed that smelled like lavender and dust. Sunlight cut through lace curtains. Somewhere downstairs, a clock ticked. My hands weren't shaking anymore. My hands were young. Soft. Unbroken. I sat up slowly. My heart was pounding, but my mind was calm. Ice calm. I knew this room. I knew this house. I knew exactly what day it was. 3 years before the contract. 3 years before the wedding that killed me. I pressed my palm against my chest and felt it beating, steady and sure. Alive. Not broken on wet pavement. Not laughed at by a woman wearing my mother's perfume. Rose. That perfume. Camille always wore rose, thick and sweet, like something rotting under sugar. I would know that smell anywhere. It would follow me for the rest of this life, whether I wanted it to or not. I got out of bed and walked to the mirror. A girl looked back at me, young, unmarked, unaware of what was coming. But I was aware. I remembered every betrayal down to the smallest detail. Every smile that hid a knife. This time, I told myself, I would not be the one bleeding on the ground. My father knocked twice before entering, the way he always did. Richard Ashford. Tall, silver-haired, smelling faintly of cedar and old paper. In my last life, I trusted him completely. This time, I watched his face for the first crack. "You're up early," he said. "Big day. The Cole family arrives this afternoon." I smiled, the way I used to. Soft. Obedient. A mask I knew how to wear perfectly now. "I remember," I said. "I won't forget." He didn't notice anything strange. Why would he? Fathers rarely notice when their daughters start planning. I had 3 years to prepare for a trap I once walked into blind. This time, I intended to build it myself. Downstairs, the house smelled like fresh bread and lemon polish. My stepmother Diane sat at the long table, sipping tea from a cup rimmed in gold. She looked up when I entered, her smile thin as paper. "Ivy," she said. "You look well rested." "I slept perfectly," I said. Camille walked in behind her, hair curled, dress pressed, smug before she'd even said a word. In my last life, I loved her like a sister. I didn't know yet what love could cost. This time, I already knew the price, and I had already decided not to pay it. "The Coles are coming today," Camille said, eyes bright with hunger. "Julian's going to be there. I heard he's even more handsome than his photos." I remembered Julian's photos. I remembered his hands, cold and careful, counting money that wasn't his. I remembered his voice the night he told the police I stole from my own father. I remembered none of it showed on his face while he lied. "I'm sure he is," I said, and reached for the teapot. That was the first small lie I told in this new life. It would not be the last. The Cole family arrived at 4 o'clock, exactly as history remembered. Julian stepped out of the car in a gray suit, sandalwood cologne trailing behind him like smoke. It hit me like a fist to the chest. That smell. That exact smell. From the night everything ended. I did not flinch. I had 3 years to learn not to flinch. "Ivy," he said, taking my hand. His palm was smooth, soft, a hand that had never worked for anything. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you properly." "Likewise," I said, and let him kiss my knuckles like the gentleman he pretended to be. Behind him, my father and his father shook hands over a folder of documents. I already knew what was inside. A betrothal contract. A merger disguised as a marriage. Textile shares tied to a wedding date, 3 years away, with a single clause buried on page 11 that no one but me would ever read carefully enough. That clause would matter later. I filed it away and said nothing. That night, I lay awake and made a list in my head. Not on paper, paper could be found. I listed everyone who had lied to me in my last life, every debt, every account, every secret I had learned only after it was too late to use them. This time, I would learn them first. I thought about my mother, my real mother, who died when I was young. I remembered a name she used to whisper: a lawyer, an old friend, someone she trusted before Diane ever entered this house. I hadn't thought of that name in years. In this life, I intended to find him before anyone else did. There was one more thing I remembered from that night on the pavement. A phone call Julian made, right before he left me there. I didn't hear who answered. But I remembered the number pattern he dialed. Burned into memory the way pain burns things in. I would get that number. I would learn exactly who it belonged to. I fell asleep smelling rain that hadn't started falling yet. The years passed the way years do. When you're waiting. I studied harder than anyone expected. I learned bookkeeping from the estate accountant, pretending it was a hobby. I learned which lawyers in the city didn't answer to my father. I found the name my mother used to whisper: Elias Whitfield, and I wrote him a letter no one else ever saw. He wrote back within a week. Careful, formal, curious about a girl he hadn't heard from in years. I didn't tell him everything. Not yet. I only told him enough to keep the door open. Camille grew louder every year, more certain the world owed her something. She flirted with Julian at every family dinner, careless and confident, the way people are when they've never once been punished. I watched her do it and said nothing. Let her build the cage herself. I would only need to close the door. By the time I turned 19, the wedding contract was 6 months from expiring. My father called me into his study one evening, his face unusually tired. "Ivy," he said, "we need to talk about the Cole engagement." I already knew what he was going to say. I had known for 3 years. Julian's father wants the marriage finalized by year's end, he said. The shares transfer with the wedding. It's a good match. A strong one. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I did the thing that would change everything. Let Camille marry him, I said. My father blinked. What? I don't want it. I said. The company. The shares. Julian. Give it to Camille. She's wanted it for years. Let her have it. He studied my face, searching for a trick he couldn't find, because I had spent 3 years learning how to hide one. You're certain, he said. Completely, I said. I have other plans for my life. I didn't tell him what those plans were. I didn't tell him about Elias Whitfield, or the bank records I'd already begun collecting, or the small, cold seed of a plan that had been growing in me since the day I woke up in that lavender-scented room. Some things a person keeps to themselves until they're ready to use them. My father didn't argue long. Relief crossed his face before he could hide it. One less complication. One less daughter to manage. Camille found out that night. I heard her before I saw her, heels clicking down the hallway fast and sharp, a sound I remembered from another life, a sound that used to mean danger was arriving. She threw open my door without knocking. Is it true? She said. Breathless. You're giving up Julian? It's true, I said. Calm as still water. She stared at me like she was waiting for the punchline. When it didn't come, something ugly flickered behind her eyes: greed, dressed up as triumph. You always were a coward, she said. Too scared to fight for anything. I let her believe that. It cost me nothing, and it would cost her everything. Enjoy him, I said. She laughed, sharp and delighted. Rose perfume thick in the air between us. That same laugh. That same smell. My stomach turned the way it always did, but my face stayed still. I will, she said. I'll enjoy every single bit of it. She had no idea what she was about to enjoy. Not yet. But she would find out piece by piece, contract clause by contract clause, exactly the way I intended her to. That was the last time Camille ever looked at me like I was beneath her without a flicker of doubt behind it. 2 weeks later, the engagement was announced publicly, a glittering party at the Cole estate. Chandeliers threw gold light across marble floors. Champagne glasses rang like small bells. Camille wore diamonds that caught every flash of every camera. And I watched her from the edge of the room, dressed simply, holding nothing but a glass of water. Julian found me near the terrace doors. Sandalwood cologne rolling off him again, that same fist to the chest feeling rising in my throat. "You could have fought for this," he said quietly. "Why didn't you?" I looked at him for a long moment, memorizing the exact shape of his confidence, because I intended to watch it disappear. "Some things aren't worth fighting for," I said. "You'll understand eventually." He laughed, low and unbothered, the laugh of a man who had never once lost anything that mattered. "You're strange, Ivy," he said. "But I like strange." I smiled and said nothing else. There was a version of that night in my last life where I stood exactly here, wearing exactly that ring, believing exactly none of what I was about to lose. This time, I only had one thing left to do before the real work could begin. I slipped away from the party at 11, telling no one where I was going. In my coat pocket sat a folded card with an address on it, a small office, 2 blocks from the courthouse, lights still burning behind frosted glass. Elias Whitfield was waiting exactly as he'd promised. The office smelled of old leather and pipe smoke, warm against the cold outside. He looked up when I entered, older than I expected, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Your mother had the same look in her eyes," he said. "Right before she asked me for something dangerous." "I need a lawyer," I said. "One who doesn't answer to my father." "You have one," he said. "Now tell me what this is really about." I sat down across from him and began to speak. I told him about the contract, about the collateral clause on page 11, about Julian's debts I hadn't proven yet but knew were there. I did not tell him everything. Some secrets I intended to keep even from him. At least for now. He listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do. When I finished, he leaned back and studied me for a long moment. "This is going to take years," he said. "I have years," I said. "I've already spent 3 of them waiting." He didn't ask what that meant. Maybe he heard something in my voice that told him not to. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a blank retainer agreement, sliding it across the desk toward me. "Then let's begin," he said. I signed my name at the bottom. The ink still wet when I left. Outside, rain had started to fall, soft against my shoulders, nothing like the rain that once soaked into my dying skin. I walked home slowly, letting it fall, letting myself remember exactly why I was doing this. Somewhere behind me, the party was still glowing gold and champagne bright. Somewhere in that light, Camille was laughing, certain she had already won. She had no idea I was watching. She had no idea the ring on her finger came with a debt attached, a debt I had already started buying, one quiet transaction at a time. That was only the beginning. The real trap hadn't even started closing yet. The wedding happened in spring, exactly as it had before. White orchids. Gold chairs. A string quartet playing something soft and forgettable. I sat in the 3rd row, wearing pale blue, watching Camille walk down the aisle in the exact dress I once wore in another life. She looked radiant. Untouchable. A woman who believed she had won everything worth winning. I clapped along with everyone else. My face gave away nothing. Inside, a small cold voice counted down a clock only I could hear. The reception was held in the Cole family's ballroom, chandeliers dripping light onto marble floors. Camille floated through the crowd on Julian's arm. Diamonds flashing. Rose perfume trailing behind her like a banner announcing victory. She found me near the dessert table, glowing with cruelty disguised as kindness. "You should be happy for me," she said. "I got everything you gave up." "I am happy," I said. "Truly." She studied my face, hunting for jealousy she couldn't find. When she didn't find it, she filled the silence with something crueler instead. "You'll die alone in some little apartment," she said, smiling sweetly. While I run this entire company, I remembered a different version of that sentence, whispered over my body in the rain. This time it landed differently. This time, I already knew how the story ended. "Enjoy the company," I said, and walked away before she could see my smile. 6 months later, I was living in a small apartment above a bakery, 3 blocks from the harbor. The building smelled like flour and cinnamon every morning before dawn. My hands, once soft and useless, grew calloused from kneading dough and stacking crates. I liked the calluses. They reminded me I was building something real this time, instead of waiting to be handed something rotten. My new life had real friends in it. Mara, who owned the bakery, taught me to read a room the way she read a proof of dough: patient, exact, unhurried. Tom, who fixed the ovens, brought me coffee every morning without being asked. Small kindnesses. Real ones. Nothing like the gilded cruelty I grew up inside. I told none of them who I really was, or what I was building in the hours after the ovens went cold. 3 nights a week, I met Elias Whitfield in his cramped office near the courthouse. The room smelled of leather and pipe smoke, the same as always, steady and grounding. A brass clock ticked on his desk, marking time toward a deadline neither of us said out loud. "The betrothal contract's collateral clause," he said one evening, sliding a photocopy toward me. "You were right. It's tied to company solvency, not just the marriage." "I know," I said. "I read it 3 years ago." He looked up at me, something sharpening in his gaze. "You've been planning this a long time. Longer than you know," I said, and left it there. He didn't press. Good lawyers rarely do, when the client is paying attention to detail they never explain. Instead, he handed me a second folder, thinner, marked with a name that made my pulse tick faster than it should have. Marcus Voss. "Your instincts about Julian's finances," Whitfield said. "They're worse than you thought." I opened the folder under the desk lamp. Bank transfers. Late-night wire records. A pattern of losses stretching back 2 years, all funneled through offshore accounts with Voss's name buried 3 layers deep. In my last life, I found this too late, after the wedding ring, after the betrayal, after the fall. This time, I had it 18 months before the contract expired. In my past life, I found out about the offshore account too late, I said quietly. This time, I had the bank records before he even knew I was awake. Whitfield frowned. "What does that mean?" "Nothing," I said. "Just talking to myself." He let it go, the way he always did, and turned back to the folder. We spent that evening mapping the debt: how much Julian owed, how fast the interest compounded, how close the balloon payment sat to the wedding anniversary written into the collateral clause. Every number told the same story. Julian Cole was drowning, and Camille had married the anchor pulling him down. "There's a man who might sell that debt," Whitfield said carefully. "If someone wanted to buy it before Voss calls it in." I looked up. "How much?" He told me a number that made the printer in the corner seem suddenly very loud. I had spent 3 years quietly moving my mother's old inheritance, a small offshore account she'd left me, one Diane never knew existed, one my father had forgotten in the chaos after her death. It wasn't enough. Not yet. But it was close. "Start the negotiation," I said. Quietly. "No names attached to mine." "You understand what you're asking," Whitfield said. "If this works, you'll own the debt that's crushing your own family's new son-in-law." "I understand exactly what I'm asking," I said. I didn't tell him the rest, that owning that debt meant owning the leverage buried on page 11 of a contract I'd read years before anyone thought to ask what it meant. Some secrets stay mine until the moment they matter most. That was the first quiet move in a war no one else knew had started. Weeks passed in careful silence. I printed documents at a copy shop across town, the machine humming, the smell of warm toner sharp in the small room. I saved screenshots of financial statements Camille posted online without thinking: a new car, a vacation, a renovation, each one paid for with money that technically didn't exist yet. She had no idea I was watching every post like a ledger. I hired a quiet man named Reyes, a private investigator recommended by Whitfield, to photograph Julian's late-night meetings near the docks. Reyes worked slow and careful, delivering envelopes of photographs that smelled faintly of cigarette, smoke, and rain. In one photograph, Julian stood beneath a flickering streetlight, handing an envelope to a man in a long coat. Marcus Voss. I recognized him from the file. His face was ordinary. Forgettable, the kind of man who ruined lives without ever raising his voice. That photograph would matter later. I filed it carefully and said nothing to anyone. At the family dinners I still occasionally attended, Camille grew louder every month, more brittle beneath the polish. She wore new jewelry every time I saw her. Each piece more expensive than the last. Funded by shares that were quietly rotting from the inside. The factory expansion's finally approved, she announced one evening, swirling wine in a crystal glass. Julian's father says we'll double revenue by next year. I already knew about the factory. I already knew about the land it sat on, soil tested years ago by a company Julian's father paid to bury the results. Contaminated ground, hidden under fresh concrete, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony no one questioned. That's wonderful, I said, and meant every cold word of it. Diane watched me from across the table, something uneasy flickering behind her composed smile. She'd never trusted my calm. Not once, not even when I was a child. Mothers sometimes sense the shape of a knife before they see the blade. You've changed, Ivy, she said quietly. I've grown up, I said. She didn't argue, but her eyes stayed on me a beat too long, the way someone watches a door they suspect is about to open. That night, walking home through rain-slicked streets, my phone buzzed in my pocket. An unknown number. I answered without speaking first. Miss Reyes, said Elias Whitfield's careful voice, using the alias I'd asked him to use for calls like this. The debt sale went through. Quietly. Untraceable to your name. I stopped walking. Rain collecting on my shoulders, cold and steady. How much of it? I asked. All of it, he said. Every dollar Julian Cole owes Marcus Voss now belongs to a shell company you control. I closed my eyes, letting the rain fall, letting the moment settle into my bones. Somewhere across the city, a man who once destroyed my life was sitting inside a house he thought was his, unaware the ground beneath him already belonged to me. Good, I said. Don't call this number again unless something changes. I hung up and kept walking. Rain running down the back of my collar, cold and clean. For the first time since I woke up in that lavender room, something inside me felt almost calm. Almost. Not quite. There was still so much left to build. 6 weeks later, the first crack appeared. I felt it before I heard about it, a strange, electric quiet at a family lunch, Diane's smile too tight, Camille's laugh landing a half-second late. Something was wrong in that house, and none of them knew why yet. The bank called about a loan restructuring, Camille said carelessly, waving a hand. Julian says it's nothing. Just paperwork. I sipped my tea and said nothing, because I already knew exactly whose paperwork it was. That evening, my phone buzzed again. Reyes this time, his voice low and quick. Voss met with someone from the bank today, he said. Your name never came up. But someone's definitely tightening the leash. Keep watching, I said. Don't get close enough to be seen. I hung up and sat by my window, watching rain streak down the glass, remembering the exact sound of Camille's heels the night she gloated over stealing my life. That same sound would echo differently soon. I intended to make sure of it. 2 days later, an envelope arrived at the Cole estate. I wasn't there to see it delivered, but Whitfield described it to me over the phone with quiet satisfaction, a formal notice from a debt-holding entity, demanding an accelerated repayment schedule within 90 days. Camille called me that night, her voice sharp with panic disguised as anger. Do you know anything about this? She demanded. Some company's trying to collect on Julian's accounts early. I have no idea what you're talking about, I said, perfectly calm. Is everything all right? She was quiet for a moment, breathing hard on the other end of the line. Everything's fine, she said finally. It's just paperwork. I hung up first, something Camille had never once allowed in my last life. That small act felt larger than it should have. A door closing softly, somewhere deep inside me, on a version of myself who used to wait for permission to hang up a phone. The following week, I stood in Elias Whitfield's office again, the brass clock ticking louder than usual. He slid a fresh folder across the desk, thicker than before. The soil report, he said. Someone finally leaked the original test results. I opened it slowly. Photographs of drilled samples. Chemical readings far past legal limits. A geologist's signature, dated years earlier, buried under a settlement no one was supposed to find. Julian's father paid to bury this, I said. He did, Whitfield said. Which means fraud charges aren't far behind, once this becomes public. I looked up at him, memorizing the exact weight of that folder in my hands. Not yet, I said. We wait for the right moment. One truth at a time. Whitfield studied me for a long, quiet moment. The way people study something they're only beginning to understand is far more dangerous than it looks. You're not just defending yourself, he said slowly. You're taking the whole thing apart, piece by piece. I'm finishing something, I said. That's all you need to know. He didn't ask again. Instead, he closed the folder and locked it in the drawer beside my mother's old letters, another quiet stone added to a wall I'd been building for years. Outside, the sky had turned the color of old bruises, heavy with a storm that hadn't broken yet. I stood on the courthouse steps and let the wind pull at my coat, thinking of Camille's laugh, of rose perfume thick in warm air, of a debt she didn't know she was standing on. Somewhere behind me, thunder rolled low across the city. It sounded almost like applause. I didn't hear from Camille for almost a month. That silence should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt like the quiet before a door slams somewhere in a house you can't see. The call came on a Thursday, late afternoon, flour still dusting my hands from the bakery ovens. Her voice was different this time. Sharper. Uglier at the edges, like something finally cracking loose. You did this, she said. No greeting, no pretense. I don't know how, but you did this. Did what? I said, wiping my hands slowly on my apron. The bank froze the joint account this morning, she snapped. Julian's lawyer says someone bought his debt. Someone's been circling us for months. I let the silence stretch just long enough to feel uncomfortable. That sounds stressful, I said. I'm sorry you're going through that. Don't. She hissed. Don't pretend you're sorry. You've always hated me. You've always wanted this to fail. There it was, the mask finally slipping, the version of Camille I remembered from the rain, cruel and certain and blind to everything but her own fear. I hope it works out for you, I said, and hung up before she could scream anything else. I stood in the small kitchen above the bakery, heart steady, breathing even. Somewhere across the city, panic was spreading through a marble house full of things that no longer belonged to the people living in it. I let myself feel exactly 1 second of satisfaction before pushing it away. There was still work to do. 2 nights later, Camille showed up at my apartment unannounced, mascara smudged, heels loud on the stairwell outside my door. That sound, sharp, uneven, frantic, struck something deep and old in me. In my last life, that same rhythm of heels had walked away from my body in the rain, laughing. I opened the door before she could knock. You need to fix this, she said, pushing past me into the small room. Whatever you're doing, you need to stop. I'm not doing anything, I said calmly. I bake bread and pay my rent. She spun around, rose perfume thick and cloying in the tiny apartment, and for one dizzying second I was back on wet pavement, blood cooling around my head, that exact scent hanging in the rain above me. I breathed through it. Slow. Controlled. Not here. Not now. You always thought you were better than me, Camille said, voice cracking. Well, look at you. Flour on your hands. Living above a bakery like some peasant. I'm happy, I said simply. You're pathetic, she spat. And soon you'll be alone, watching me lose everything, and you'll finally understand what it feels like to have nothing. I studied her face for a long moment, the fear underneath the fury, the desperation dressed up as cruelty. This was the 4th time. First, whispers behind my back. Then, stealing my place at the table. Then, mocking me in front of everyone at that glittering party. And now this standing in my home. Threatening the little I'd built, certain I was the reason her world was cracking. You should go, I said quietly. Before you say something you can't take back. She laughed. Hollow and thin. I already have everything I need to ruin what's left of your reputation, she said. 1 phone call. That's all it would take. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. Not fear. Recognition. This was the moment I remembered from before, almost exactly like this, except in my last life. I hadn't known to record it. This time, my phone sat on the counter behind her, screen dark, recording app already running from the moment she started climbing the stairs. Do what you need to do, I said evenly. She stared at me a moment longer, searching for the crack she used to find so easily. She didn't find it. Whatever she saw in my face instead made her step back toward the door. You've changed, she said, echoing her mother's words from weeks before. People do that, I said, when they stop waiting to be saved. She left without another word, heels striking the stairwell hard and fast, fading into the wet night outside. I locked the door, walked to the counter, and stopped the recording with steady hands. Threat of reputational sabotage, admission of financial panic, veiled confession about knowing more than she should. Whitfield would know exactly what to do with this. I sat by the window a long time after she left, listening to rain tap against the glass, remembering the taste of copper and the smell of gin from another life's ending. My PTSD didn't announce itself loudly anymore. It came in small waves, a scent, a sound, a rhythm of footsteps, and passed through me like weather. I let it pass. Then I made a phone call. She threatened me tonight, I told Whitfield. It's recorded. Send it over, he said. This changes the timeline. How much does it change? I asked. We might not need to wait for the wedding anniversary deadline, he said. This could move things faster. I looked out at the rain-soaked street below, thinking of the question I'd carried since the night I woke up in that lavender room, the one open loop I'd never let myself answer out loud. Would revenge feel the way I imagined, once it finally arrived? Or would it feel like nothing at all? Move it faster, I said. I'm ready. The following week, everything accelerated at once. Reyes delivered a new set of photographs. Julian meeting Voss again, this time exchanging something small and sealed in the alley behind a shuttered restaurant. Whitfield confirmed the bribery angle. Payments to a city inspector, meant to keep the contaminated factory site quiet a little longer. Bribery. Fraud. A frightened wife threatening her own sister on tape. Each piece slid into place with a quiet, satisfying click, like a key finally fitting a lock I'd spent years learning to pick. One evening, sitting across from Whitfield's cluttered desk, I finally told him the piece I'd been holding back. I know why the collateral clause matters, I said. It reverts company control to the original shareholder if the debt defaults before the anniversary date. Whitfield went very still. You wrote that clause, he said slowly. 3 years ago. Before any of this started. I suggested the language, I said. My father's lawyer thought it was standard protection. No one ever asked why a 19-year-old cared about default provisions. He leaned back in his chair, studying me the way you study a chess match you've just realized was never close to fair. You planned this before Julian ever proposed to Camille, he said. I planned this before Julian ever met either of us, I said quietly. In another version of this, I didn't. I paid for that mistake with my life. He didn't ask what I meant by that. Some questions, good lawyers know better than to ask. The default clause triggers automatically, he said instead. Once the debt holder calls in the loan. Then let's call it in, I said. Soon. Not yet. But soon. Outside his window, the storm that had been building for weeks finally broke, thunder rolling low over rooftops, rain hammering hard against the glass. Somewhere across the city, a marble house stood full of secrets about to come apart at every seam. I thought of Camille's heels on my stairwell. Sharp and frightened. I thought of Julian's cologne, sandalwood thick in cold night air, meeting a man in a long coat under flickering light. I thought of the soil report, buried and waiting. And the recording sitting safely in a locked drawer beside my mother's letters. One question from years ago finally had an answer. Yes. Revenge, when it came, would feel exactly the way I imagined, cold, precise, and entirely mine to control. But there was still a second question I hadn't answered yet. One I hadn't even let myself ask clearly until that stormy night. What would I do, when it was finally over, and there was nothing left standing between Camille and the fall she'd built for herself? I didn't know yet. I only knew the answer was coming fast now, faster than either of them could see. The contract expired at midnight, exactly 90 days after the frozen account. I sat in Whitfield's office watching the brass clock tick toward it, calm as still water. It's time, he said, closing the last folder. Send everything, I said. He nodded once, picked up the phone, and began making calls that would end a life built entirely on borrowed things. By morning, the debt notice had been formally filed, demanding immediate repayment in full. Julian couldn't pay it. Everyone would know why within hours. At 9, Whitfield's firm released a statement to 3 major newspapers. Fraud allegations. Contaminated land. A buried soil report with a geologist's signature attached. Photographs of Voss meeting Julian in the dark. At 10, the state's environmental agency opened a formal investigation into Ashford Textile's new factory site. At 11, an anonymous tip reached the district attorney's office, detailing a pattern of bribery involving a city inspector and payments traced through offshore accounts. By noon, Camille's phone would not stop ringing. I wasn't there to see her face, but Ray's was, parked outside the Cole estate with a long lens and steady hands. He sent photographs throughout the afternoon. Camille, pacing the driveway, mascara smeared, heels abandoned on the marble steps behind her. Julian's business partner called Whitfield's office at 1 o'clock, severing every remaining contract between their 2 companies. By 2, 3 separate investors had publicly withdrawn support, their statements brief and cold. The dominoes fell fast now. Faster than even I expected. At 3, a reporter published the soil report online, photographs of drilled samples spreading across social media within minutes. Comment sections filled with outrage. Old customers demanded refunds. New customers demanded answers. By 4, the bank formally called in Julian's remaining debt, citing the fraud investigation as cause. The default clause triggered exactly as written, exactly as I'd planned it 3 years earlier, on a page 11 no one else had ever thought to read twice. Company control reverted to the original shareholder. To May. I read the notice twice, standing in my small kitchen above the bakery, flowers still dusting the counter beside me. Something in my chest loosened, slow and quiet, like a held breath finally released. The reward Camille had been so greedy to grab wasn't a reward at all. It had always been a trap, built long before she reached for it, waiting patiently for exactly this day. That evening, I finally went to the estate myself. I hadn't set foot there in months. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the marble dimmer, the chandeliers somehow less impressive than they'd seemed in another life. Diane met me at the door, her composure entirely gone. Dark circles ringed her eyes. Her hands trembled around a crystal glass she'd forgotten to fill. "You did this," she said, no longer bothering to sound composed. "Somehow, all of this is you." "I didn't force anyone to lie," I said. "I didn't force anyone to bribe an inspector, or bury a soil report, or borrow money from a man like Marcus Voss." "You could have warned us," she said. "I did warn you," I said quietly. 3 years ago. You just weren't listening." She stared at me. Something breaking behind her eyes, years of quiet suspicion finally confirmed too late to matter. I found Camille in what used to be the sitting room, sitting alone on the floor beside an overturned jewelry box, diamonds scattered across the rug like fallen stars. Her mascara had run in long dark streaks. Her rose perfume had faded to something thin and sour, the scent of fear replacing whatever confidence it used to carry. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked exactly her age. Young. Frightened. Ordinary. "Everyone's gone," she said, not looking up. "The investors. The staff. Even Julian's father won't answer his phone." "I know," I said. She looked up then, eyes red-rimmed, hatred and confusion tangled together on her face. "Why?" she said. "Why would you do this to me?" I sat down slowly in the chair across from her, close enough to see every crack finally showing through the surface she used to wear so easily. "You want the truth," I said. "Yes," she said, voice breaking. "For once, just tell me the truth." I studied her a long moment, deciding exactly how much of it she deserved to hear. "I gave you the engagement because I already knew what it was," I said. "Julian's debts. The contaminated land. All of it. I didn't hand you a gift, Camille. I handed you a trap, and you were too greedy to check what was inside it." Her mouth opened, closed, opened again, no sound coming out. "You knew," she whispered. "This whole time. You knew. From the very beginning," I said. She flinched like I'd struck her, some final illusion collapsing behind her eyes. "That's impossible," she said. "You couldn't have known. Not that far back. I could have stopped there. I almost did. But 3 years of silence had built up something inside me that wanted, just once, to speak completely freely. "I've known things about you longer than you'd ever believe," I said quietly. "Longer than this lifetime, if you want the truth of it." She stared at me, uncomprehending, the way people stare at something too strange to fit inside their understanding of the world. "What does that mean?" she said. "It doesn't matter anymore," I said. "What matters is this. Everything that's happening to you right now, the debt, the fraud charges, the fall, none of it came from luck. It came from 3 years of very careful work." Her hands trembled against the scattered diamonds. "The lawsuit," she said slowly, piecing it together. "The frozen account. The soil report leak. That was all you." "All of it," I said. "Every piece." She let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, sharp and broken in the empty room. "I should have known," she said. "The moment you gave this up so easily. I should have known you were planning something." "You should have," I agreed. But greed doesn't leave much room for suspicion. Outside, I could hear sirens approaching, distant but growing closer, drawn by the fraud investigation now moving fast through official channels. Camille heard them too, her face draining paler with every second. "They're coming for Julian," she said, panic rising in her voice. "Aren't they?" "Probably," I said. "His debts, his bribes. Not really my concern anymore." "And me?" she asked. "What happens to me?" I looked at her for a long moment, the woman who once laughed above my dying body, now sitting broken on an expensive rug, asking me for mercy she'd never once considered offering anyone else. "That depends on what you tell the investigators," I said. "And how honest you're finally willing to be." I stood up, smoothing my coat, and walked toward the door. Behind me, Camille's voice cracked into something almost pleading. "Ivy, wait," she said. "Please. Just tell me why. Why go this far? What did I ever do to deserve this?" I paused at the threshold, one hand on the cold brass handle, and let myself finally say the words I'd carried since the night I died on wet pavement, alone. "In another life," I said quietly. "You laughed while I bled out on a sidewalk. You and Julian both. I remember every second of it." She stared at me, uncomprehending, but something in my voice must have carried enough weight to silence her completely. "I don't expect you to understand that," I said. "I just needed you to hear it. Once. Before this ends." I stepped outside into cool evening air, sirens louder now, red and blue light beginning to flicker against the estate's marble walls. I didn't look back. I had already seen everything I needed to see. Whitfield called an hour later. His voice steady but unmistakably relieved. "Julian's been taken in for questioning," he said. "Bribery, fraud, financial misconduct. The DA's office is building a strong case." "And the company?" I asked. "Fully reverted," he said. "You're the sole controlling shareholder as of this afternoon." I stood on the sidewalk outside the estate, watching flashing lights paint the marble walls red and blue, thinking of how differently the same street had looked to me once, in another life, another ending. "Thank you," I said. "For everything." "Don't thank me yet," Whitfield said. "There's still the matter of Marcus Voss. He doesn't take losing his leverage well." I looked down the street, toward the docks where Julian used to meet him under flickering light, and felt something settle cold and certain inside my chest. "Let him come," I said. "I've been ready for him a lot longer than he knows." Marcus Voss found me 3 days later, waiting outside the bakery in the gray hour before dawn. He leaned against a dark sedan, unremarkable in a long coat. Exactly as ordinary as his photographs suggested. "You've been busy," he said, when I stepped outside. "I have," I agreed, locking the door behind me. "You bought my debt through a shell company," he said. "Clever. Untraceable. Almost. Almost." I studied him in the pale morning light, no menace in his posture, just quiet calculation, the same cold arithmetic I'd learned to use myself. "You lost your leverage the moment I owned the paper," I said. "Julian's fraud charges aren't my problem to fix now. They're yours to worry about." Voss almost smiled, something dry and appreciative crossing his face. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Most people who buy debt like this want revenge. You wanted control." I wanted both, I said. I only needed to be patient about which one came first. He studied me a long moment, weighing something behind his flat, careful eyes. For what it's worth, he said, I never touch anything I don't get paid for. Julian hired himself a very expensive habit. That's not my concern anymore either. Then we understand each other, I said. He nodded once, opened his car door, and paused before stepping inside. Good luck with the company, he said. You'll need sharper instincts than the last owners had. I've had 3 years to sharpen them, I said. He didn't ask what that meant. He simply drove away into the gray morning, taillights fading down the empty street, one more loose thread finally tied off and set aside. I stood there a moment longer, breathing cold air, listening to the bakery ovens hum awake behind me. Somewhere in that quiet, ordinary sound, I felt the last real danger of this life finally pass. That afternoon, Whitfield called with news I'd been waiting years to hear. Camille's cooperating with investigators, he said. Full statement. Names, dates, the bribery scheme, everything. And Julian, I asked. Facing multiple charges, he said. Fraud, bribery, financial misconduct. His father's company is under federal review. I sat by my window, watching late sunlight spill gold across the harbor, and let myself finally think through everything I'd built, piece by careful piece. Since the night I woke up 16 years old in a lavender-scented room. The engagement I gave away wasn't generosity. It was bait. Dangled in front of a woman too greedy to check what it was tied to. The debt I quietly purchased wasn't just financial strategy. It was the mechanism that would collapse everything from the inside, the moment the timing was right. The lawsuit, the leaked soil report, the recorded threat, the frozen accounts, none of it was reactive. Every piece had been assembled years in advance, waiting patiently for the exact moment it would matter most. And the collateral clause on page 11, the one I'd suggested at 19 with a calm voice and an innocent excuse, had been the final lock clicking shut on a cage. I started building the very night I opened my eyes in this second life. I hadn't reacted to Camille's greed. I had engineered it. Carefully. Patiently. Using the one thing she'd never once suspected, that I already knew exactly who she was, and exactly what she was capable of, long before she ever proved it to anyone else. That was the piece none of them ever saw coming. Not my father, not Diane, not Camille, not even Julian, standing somewhere in a holding cell right now, wondering how his carefully hidden debts had unraveled so precisely, so completely, so fast. I hadn't simply survived my second chance. I had spent every quiet year of it building the exact weapon required to end the story properly this time. The sun dipped lower, painting the harbor gold and rose, and for the first time in either of my lives, that particular shade of rose didn't turn my stomach at all. It just looked like sunset. Ordinary. Beautiful. Mine. There was one more conversation left before this could truly end. One more room I needed to walk into. One more version of myself I needed to leave behind for good. I visited Julian once, in the gray visitation room at the county jail, before any of the rest of this happened. Concrete walls. Buzzing fluorescent light. A thick pane of scratched glass between us. He looked smaller than I remembered, sandalwood cologne long gone, replaced by something sour and institutional. His hands shook slightly around the phone receiver. "Why are you here?" he said, voice flat with exhaustion. "I wanted to see your face," I said. "One last time, before this ends." "You did this," he said. "All of it. The debt, the leaks, the charges. I know it was you. You did this," I said calmly. "Every choice was yours. I only made sure you couldn't hide from any of them." He stared at me through the glass, something desperate flickering behind his exhaustion. "We could have had a good life," he said quietly. "If you'd married me instead of her," I almost laughed. "Almost. In another life, I did marry you," I said. "You know exactly how that one ended." Confusion crossed his face, quick and genuine, a man hearing a sentence he couldn't place anywhere in his memory. "What are you talking about?" he said. "It doesn't matter now," I said. "You'll never remember it." "I will. For both of us." He opened his mouth to argue, but a guard's hand landed on his shoulder, signaling the visit's end. I hung up the receiver without waiting for him to speak again, and walked out of that gray room without a single backward glance. That was the last time I ever saw Julian Cole's face. It felt lighter than I expected, closing that particular door for good. The deposition room smelled like leather and stale coffee, fluorescent light humming overhead. Diane sat across the table, hands folded too tightly, a court reporter's pen tapping softly against her notepad. I hadn't planned to be here. Whitfield insisted I should, once he found what the investigators uncovered while tracing Diane's financial history alongside Julian's fraud case. "You wanted this meeting," Diane said, voice brittle. "Whitfield said you had something to say before the final settlement." "I do," I said, sitting down slowly across from her. She watched me with the same wary suspicion she'd worn for years. The look of someone who always sensed a blade she couldn't quite locate. "The investigators found something else while auditing the estate accounts," I said quietly. "Something from years ago. Before any of this." Her face went very still. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "My mother's medical records," I said. "The ones you had access to, the year she died. There were irregularities no one questioned at the time, because no one was looking." The pen stopped tapping. The room went entirely silent. "You can't prove anything," Diane said, voice thin as paper now. "I don't need to prove it today," I said. "The investigators reopened the file this morning. That's not something I control anymore." She stared at me, something collapsing behind her carefully composed face, years of quiet secrecy finally catching up to a woman who thought she'd buried it deep enough. I felt no triumph watching it happen. Only a strange, settled kind of stillness, the same stillness I'd carried since the night I woke up 16 again, ready to finish something I hadn't even fully understood yet. "Why?" Diane whispered. "Why dig up something so far in the past?" "Because you weren't just careless with your daughter's greed," I said. "You were careless with my mother's life." "I only just learned how careless." "This week." She didn't answer. There wasn't an answer that would have mattered anymore. I stood, smoothing my coat, and looked at her one final time, a woman who once ruled a marble house with quiet cruelty, now small and frightened under fluorescent light. "Whitfield will handle everything from here," I said. "I'm done in this room." I walked out without looking back. The door closing softly behind me, sealing away the last piece of a life I no longer needed to carry. Outside, Elias Whitfield waited by the elevators, hands in his coat pockets, expression unreadable. "You never told me about your mother's file," he said quietly. "I only found the pattern myself, recently," I said. "You knew her longest. Did you ever suspect anything?" He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "I suspected," he said. "For years. I never had proof. When you wrote me that first letter, something about your questions told me you already knew more than you were saying. You helped me anyway," I said. "Without proof. Without knowing why." "Your mother helped me once, a long time ago," he said. "When no one else would. I promised myself I'd repay that, if her daughter ever came looking." I studied his face. Understanding, finally settling into place, the third quiet hand in everything I'd built, loyal not to me alone, but to a debt owed long before I was ever born into either version of this life. "Thank you," I said. "For all of it." "Thank your mother," he said. "I just kept a promise." We rode the elevator down together in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who've finished something difficult side by side. Weeks passed quickly after that. The company restructured under new leadership, mine, guided carefully by people I trusted instead of people who trusted only themselves. Julian's trial moved forward, slow and public, exactly as it should have. Camille's cooperation earned her a lighter sentence, though not a life anyone would envy. Diane's case reopened quietly, without headlines, exactly the way justice sometimes arrives late, unglamorous, but real. I sold the marble estate within the year. I never once regretted it. I bought a small plot of land instead, an hour outside the city, with a greenhouse and overgrown garden beds and a view of nothing but hills and open sky. Mara helped me choose the paint for the kitchen. Tom fixed the ancient water heater without being asked, the same as always. On quiet mornings, I walk barefoot through the garden, dirt cool and soft beneath my feet. Sunlight falls warm across my shoulders. The exact opposite of cold rain on a Tuesday. Another life away. I kneel sometimes among the tomato plants, fingers pressed into dark soil, and I think about that girl who died alone on a sidewalk, copper taste on her tongue, someone else's laughter fading into the dark above her. I am not her anymore. I made sure of that. One quiet decision at a time. Across 3 patient years, and one very long war. Birds call somewhere in the hedges beyond the fence. The air smells like turned earth and early lavender, nothing at all like rose. Nothing at all like sandalwood or gin or fear. I built this piece myself. No one handed it to me. No one will ever take it away again. Some people ask if I ever forgave them. Camille, Julian, Diane, all the small cruelties stacked into one long betrayal. I don't think forgiveness was ever the point. I only wanted the truth spoken clearly. Once. And the story finally allowed to end. I got exactly that. Nothing more. Nothing less. The sun is warm today. The soil is soft between my fingers. Somewhere far behind me, an old life ended in the rain, and a new one began in the quiet. Patient work of building something no one could ever take from me twice. If you were me, would you have saved her, or walked away? Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching from?